Today I'm speaking with Graham Catt, who, after more than 2 decades experience leading member-based organisations in sectors including business, health, animal health and agriculture, is the CEO of Independent Schools Australia. ISA is the peak education body representing more than 1,200 independent schools, nearly 750,000 students and a workforce of 120,000 people. Graham, thanks again for the opportunity to have a chat today.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Graham, let's just start off with a little bit about you and your background and I guess what led you to this role in education.
Yeah, as you mentioned in your introduction, my pathway here is probably a little bit more eclectic than many others. I was a humanities graduate. I studied English literature and drama at university. We actually went on and did a master's in English lit. I went from there into communications and I worked for a range of different organisations, began as a writer, moved into a broader content creation role, moved from there into communication strategy, and in the very early 2000s I actually founded my own business with some partners and ran that for about 4 years. At that point I was still young enough to say, actually, I still want another pathway, I want another change, what can I do that's different? So I actually sold out of that business and looked around for the next thing. And where I found myself was working for the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. That's a medical college, but it's also a membership body at that time for about 25,000 doctors. And I came into that role. I was very interested in my communications work in how you engage, how you build communities particularly, not so much how you sell things, but how you engage with people and communicate effectively with them. And that was the beginning of that pathway. I started at the RACGP running the New South Wales and ACT as a general manager, and I went on to CEO roles in a wide variety of sectors. To me, when the role of Independent Schools Australia became available, and I moved there about just under 2 years ago, at the beginning of 2023, when that role became available, it really was fascinating to me. I'm a learner. I'm still very curious, and I think that's a real leadership trait, is we need to be curious, we need to always be learning. And so I was fascinated to think, here's a sector that I know very little about. All of my career in associations has involved adult learning. I've run a registered training organisation. I've run quite extensive programs in professional development. I've built relationships with universities and collaborated, but school education was a new thing to me. So, when I thought about it, I thought, all of the challenges I think we face as a society, all of the crossroads we face in terms of what path we go down, actually, education lies at the heart of those. And what dictates the road we go down very much depends on what we learn now and how we approach education now. And I found that fascinating as a policy person, as a leader. And finally, I'm a dad, so I've still got 2 children that are school age, and having that skin in the game for me was also something that I thought, looked at this role, and this is fantastic. I've actually got a genuine involvement in that and a real interest. So I'm very blessed. It's been a fantastic opportunity, and really enjoying myself almost 2 years into the role.
Graham, that's fantastic, and I love your thinking around being a lifelong learner, and that's what we're about in the world of education for sure. You mentioned some of the wealth of leadership experience you had there. Just if you can share with us just your approach on leading during times of maybe disruption or change, and such as the impact of external pressures.
I think I'm fortunate because I do bring that eclectic experience with me. I think what we have a tendency to do, and I have observed this working across sectors, is what I call retreat into our vertical. And it's a very natural trend to say, when I'm being impacted by external forces, they're only impacting me, they're only impacting my organisation, or they're only impacting my sector, or they're only impacting my part of the world. That's rarely true. Often they're things that are impacting all of us at the same time across multiple sectors. And there's great scope there to actually say, well, how's this affecting others, and who can I collaborate, and where can I look to learn? But the other thing I've learned is often they have affected other sectors, other professions, other areas in similar ways in the past, and there's a great deal that we can learn from actually looking at those things. So I think the first element of that, and I ran a Chamber of Commerce during COVID for 2 years, so that was the ultimate disruption of the past decade, was actually how do we deal with that? How does business deal with that? How do they adapt and change to move forward? But a lot of those answers lay in looking at what's happening around us, what are other people doing, how are other people adapting. I think it tests your relationships. I'm a very relational based person. I think we've got to be focused. Why be relational rather than transactional? It's because those moments test those relationships. In what I do, that's when my relationship with a minister or a secretary or really comes to the fore, being able to have a hard conversation, have that trust there. We may not use that all the time, but it's those situations that develop that. And I think the last thing I would say is stay calm. I think what people are looking for us in those situations particularly is that calmness. They're looking for their leader when we are being impacted by external forces. People are looking at us to say, okay, if he is being strategic or she, are we thinking strategically? Are we communicating? Look, it's not just us, there are others being affected. And are we demonstrating leadership? But most of all, calmness. I think when there's a sense of panic out there, the ability to keep those who follow us and those we lead calm is a really important one as well.
Yeah, great stuff, Graham. And one of my favourite books is titled "Kids Don't Learn from Teachers They Don't Like," and it just speaks very much to that the relationship side of teaching and education and your role, those relational leadership. So thank you. Yeah, really great.
One of the challenges independent schools face is I think there's a natural inclination to want them to be a system because it helps us understand them so much easier, and we see that when we deal with our bureaucrats, for example. But they are 1,216 independent schools. They're wildly diverse in the way they approach education, their philosophies, their student bodies, their size. So they are a sector, but very, very, very different in the way that they approach things. So our role, as I say, probably the best way I can answer that is to go back to our strategy. And we define our purpose as being one national voice for that sector. The three key things we're there to do are to lead. And my interpretation of leading in this sector is to say, how do we respect and cherish that diversity? But how do we also unify? How do we assimilate all those multiple views and bring them together so that we can actually have discussions about policy? We can actually have discussions about the things that affect us collectively as well, while really recognising that the diversity and what it brings us. Our role again is to be a voice, it's to be an advocate in the policy sense as well. And our role as well is to promote really the understanding of that diversity. It's one of my most critical roles, I think, is to help the community as a whole. That includes all stakeholders, includes ministers and politicians, but the general public understand that that is what this sector is. The key issues for the sector as a starting point are the same issues that are facing every school and every sector and every system in Australia and often globally. And I think one of the great challenges is the media portrayal, I think, often that sort of says, these schools are different, they don't have the same, all these challenges only exist in the government school or the government system sector. Yeah. They're issues facing educators and they're facing education. They're not only facing particular sectors or settings. The key ones are mental health and wellbeing. We talked about that, how schools adapt and how they find their own setting and their own context, how they find a way forward. Teacher attraction and retention in the independent sector is as much an issue as it is anywhere. What we're seeing increasingly, and the concern that we're hearing from educators, I think, is also the growing gap between, as we start to rightly increase the salaries for our educators, and we've seen increases in some jurisdictions around 10+%. There is a significant gap between the indexation that comes from the government funding for an independent school, which sits at around 3 to 4%, and that sort of increase that sits at 10 to 11. What we're really starting to understand from our schools is there are very few levers you've got to pull to address that. You can increase fees from parents, you can cut programs and approaches or staff. Not much else you can actually do. Now, I think what our educators are really, really struggling with is when we've got we're in a cost of living crisis. We know that this isn't just rhetoric, it is actually truth. We know that families are genuinely struggling with paying fees. When they are increasing 10% or 11%, it's a huge dilemma for schools. How do we actually manage that? And we know that it impacts families. So I think that is one of the big challenges that we're hearing more and more from schools. The other one for many is actually how we accommodate demand. The independent sector as a sector is growing at a significant rate. Its enrolments are growing by almost 4% a year nationally. That translates into demand for places, and for many schools, that's their dilemma. It's the challenge of staying true to our purpose, which may never have been about growth, but recognising that people want to make that choice of our school and trying to think about how do we accommodate that. And that goes to capital, it goes to finding space for many smaller schools in urban settings. There's just no way to grow. They're landlocked essentially, so that's a big issue. But the third thing, and it really goes to the election campaign that we have just recently launched, is it's more and more we're hearing from schools, but increasingly from families, it's the misrepresentation that they see of themselves in the public discourse, in the media. The facts are that most independent school fees sit below $6,000 a year. The median fee is about $5,550. The data actually shows us that the majority of parents who choose schools are low to middle income earners. They're often working two incomes. They're often making real sacrifices to attend. And increasingly to see that characterisation as the words that find their way in the media are overfunded. I think we've found a way that some commentators are taking parent contributions as funding and saying these schools are overfunded when it's actually parents making that contribution. To see themselves described as elite, privileged, wealthy, is really, really starting to hurt more and more, particularly as the reality for those families again is we're actually struggling to meet. We made this choice, we are 100% behind it, we love what it offers, but we really are struggling to pick up and see yourself characterised as a privileged elite that needs no help or no support. Is something that's really disturbing. Learn how to listen. Coming from a communications background, I think I tend to frame things this way, but I did a leadership program about 6 years ago, and it was brought home to me very strongly that we think we're good listeners and we're not. Learning the skill of sitting down opposite someone and nodding when our brain is actually thinking about the next meeting. It's already assumed we know the answer to what they're asking us. It's already assumed we know more than that person does. Is not listening. It's a skill that we really need to work at and do well. Listening to our people is absolutely critical. The other thing though is that organisations communicate to us as well. So certainly listening to our teams and listening to our people. But I think as leaders we need to understand what is the organisation trying to tell us. They also communicate, and often what is said is not really what's being communicated. I think learning that ability to say, all too often, think about it as a leader when you walk into the staff room or go home at night and debrief with someone. That they're all doing this or they're all doing that or this is happening. They're trying to tell you something. And collectively, people make up organisations. They are communities of people, and those people try to let you know something. They may not have the words to do it. They may not have the ability to do it clearly. But your role as a leader is actually to say, what is it they're trying to tell me? And actually figure out how to respond to that. So I think learning the art of listening, not just to your people, but learning the art of listening to your organisation and bringing that into response is probably the key thing I've learned, not just in 20 years of being a leader, but in many years of studying the humanities before I actually got into leadership as well. And it's one of the things I really treasure from that kind of education as well.